The cereal aisle
Stay with
smelled
me,
like
Mama.
sugar and grease, and too many people standing too close together. Saturday afternoon in the Ridgewood Galleria, and the food court was a wall of noise. Trays sliding across counters, ice rattling in oversized cups, laughter stacking on top of arguments, children screaming over the hum of fluorescent lights that never quite buzzed in rhythm. 200 people moved through that space in any given hour. Each one convinced they were the center of the story. None of them were. Royce Callahan walked through the crowd the way a river cuts through rock. Slow, deliberate, unbothered. He wore a leather vest, faded black patches, stitched across the back in thread that had seen decades of sun and rain and highway wind. His boots were scuffed at the toes, steel-capped, and they struck the tile floor with a rhythm that said he had been walking hard surfaces his entire life. 58 years old, broad-shouldered, a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something stubborn. The kind of man people noticed without realizing they were noticing, the kind they gave space to without being asked. He had come to the mall for a battery, a watch battery, the kind of errand that takes 10 minutes if you know where you're going and 40 if you don't. He didn't know where he was going. He hadn't been inside a mall in 3 years, maybe more. The lights bothered him. The noise made his chest feel tight. But he needed the battery because the watch had been his son's and the watch had stopped, and Royce could not bear for one more thing connected to Derek to stop. He reached the edge of the food court and paused, not because he wanted to. His body paused for him. His left hand drifted to his chest, fingers pressing lightly against the leather, almost curious the way you press a bruise to see if it still hurts. Something moved wrong inside him. Not pain exactly, pressure. Like a fist closing slowly around something it had no business holding. He took one more step, then his knees gave out. The sound his body made when it hit the tile was not loud enough for what it meant. It was a dull, wet thud, the sound of something heavy going down without resistance. His shoulder struck first, then his hip, and his head rolled to the side cheek, pressed against the cold floor, eyes open but already drifting. Around him, the world did what the world always does when something terrible happens in a public place. It froze. 200 people in that food court, and for 3 full seconds, not a single one of them moved. Not the woman holding her smoothie 6 feet away, her straw still between her lips. Not the teenager who had been filming a video of himself eating a cinnamon roll. Not the security guard near the East Corridor, radio already in hand, finger hovering over a button he suddenly couldn't find. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed in a way that mattered. This is the part of the story people don't like hearing. Not because it's cruel, but because it's true. When crisis erupts in a crowd, the human brain does something deeply irrational. It waits. It looks around for permission, for a signal, for someone else to move first so that moving becomes safe. Psychologists call it the bystander effect. In real life, it just looks like a circle of people standing over a dying man, holding phones they haven't decided whether to use for calling 911 or recording a video. Royce Callahan's lips were turning blue. Not all at once. The color drained from the edges, first a slow bruising that crept inward like frost on glass. His chest was still. His eyes were open, but they weren't seeing the ceiling. They were seeing something further away, something none of the people standing around him could follow. 10 seconds passed. 15. At 20 seconds without oxygen, the brain begins to notice. At 60 seconds, damage begins. Irreversible damage. The kind that turns a man who once rebuilt motorcycle engines with his bare hands into someone who can't remember his own name. The clock was running. A woman gasped and covered her mouth. A man fumbled for his phone and held it up, hands shaking, unsure whether to dial or point the camera down. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked why the man was sleeping on the floor, and the mother pulled him back and turned his face away, shielding him from something she herself couldn't look at directly. The circle around Royce widened. That's what fear does. It pushes people outward, away from the thing they know they should move toward. The space between Royce Callahan and the rest of the world grew by inches, and each inch was a second he didn't have. His chest hitched once, a small involuntary movement like a car engine trying to turn over on a dead battery. Then it stilled again. His fingers twitched against the tile, then went slack. He was leaving, not slowly, not the way people leave in movies with final words and dramatic music and someone holding their hand. He was leaving the way most people actually leave. Quietly on a dirty floor surrounded by strangers, who would think about this moment for weeks and do nothing about it for the rest of their lives. But there was someone else in that food court, someone no one had noticed, someone who had spent 6 months learning how to exist in the space between seen and unseen, and who carried inside her chest a piece of knowledge so specific, so precisely taught, that it was about to become the only thing that mattered in this entire building. She was standing near the pretzel stand 30 feet away counting coins in her palm. Her name was Ren Maddox, 19 years old, though you wouldn't know it from looking at her. The streets had added years to her face, sharpened her cheekbones, hollowed her eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a knot that hadn't been washed in 4 days. Her shoes were gone, had been gone for a week now, stolen from beside her while she slept in the parking garage stairwell on the 3rd level. She wore jeans that didn't fit right and a flannel shirt buttoned to the collar, despite the heat of the food court, because when you are a young woman living in the margins, you learn to make yourself as small and shapeless as possible. 6 months she had lived inside the Ridgewood Galleria, not as a customer, not as an employee, as a ghost. She slept in stairwells. She washed her face in public restrooms with cold water and hand soap from the dispensers, and she dried her hands on her shirt when the paper towel holders were empty. She ate what she could find. Discarded fries from trays left on tables. Half-eaten sandwiches dropped into garbage cans that she checked before the cleaning crew could empty them. Sometimes the woman who cleaned the food court would leave a wrapped sandwich on the edge of a trash can, placed too carefully to be accidental. Ren never acknowledged it. The woman never looked at her when she did it. That was the agreement. Kindness, but only the kind that doesn't ask for eye contact. By noon on this particular Saturday, more than 200 people had walked past Ren Maddox without seeing her. They stepped around her when she stood too still. They looked through her when she stood in line. They flinched when she moved too fast. She had learned the architecture of invisibility, how to stand near a pillar and become part of it, how to move through a crowd at exactly the speed that makes you background noise, how to fold herself into the gaps between people who had somewhere to be. Being invisible kept her alive. A young woman alone, no phone, no ID, no address. Visibility meant questions. Questions meant records. Records meant the system, and the system had never once caught Ren Maddox without dropping her. But invisibility also meant something else. It meant that when everyone else in that food court was frozen, locked inside the paralysis of watching and waiting and hoping someone else would act, no one was watching Ren. No one was expecting anything from her. No one had any reason to believe the barefoot girl near the pretzel stand had any business kneeling beside a dying man, which is exactly why she could. She heard the sound first, not the thud of his body which she'd missed, but the silence that followed, the specific quality of quiet that happens when 200 people stop talking at the same time. It was a sound she knew, the sound of a room holding its breath, the sound that comes right before the worst thing you've ever seen. She looked up. She saw the circle. She saw the phones. She saw the space between the people and the man on the floor, and she understood instantly what that space meant. It meant no one was helping. It meant the clock was running. It meant that in another 30 seconds, it wouldn't matter if someone moved or not. Something old and deep shifted in her chest. Not a thought, not a decision, something faster than both. A memory that lived in her muscles, in her hands, in the way her knees bent and her body moved forward before her mind could catch up. She dropped the coins. They scattered across the tile with a bright, scattered sound that no one heard. And she ran, bare feet slapping against cold tile, each step sharp and immediate, the floor biting at her soles, and the sting of it did something unexpected. It kept her present. It kept her here. It kept her from disappearing into the fear that pressed at the edges of her vision like dark water rising. She dropped to her knees beside Royce Callahan. The impact sent a shock up through her thighs, sharp enough to make her gasp, but she didn't stop. Up close, he was bigger than she expected. Heavier. His chest was massive and still like a machine that had been shut off mid-cycle. The blue tinge on his lips was spreading. His eyes were open and empty. She knew this face. Not his face specifically, but this expression. The expression of a body that had given up waiting for permission to die. She placed one hand on the center of his chest, the other on top of it, fingers interlocked, elbows locked. She leaned forward, shifting her weight above him, the way her father had taught her so that the compressions came from her core, not her arms. And she pressed. Hard. 2 inches deep. The resistance was immediate, in terrible bone and muscle pushing back against her palms, and for one sickening moment she thought she was going to fail before she started. But her body remembered. Her hands remembered. The rhythm found her the way a song finds you when you haven't heard it in years, but never really forgot. 1, she said out loud. 2, 3. Her voice was steady. She didn't know how. Inside her chest, her own heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. But her voice was steady, and her hands were steady, and the count came out of her like a rope she was throwing into deep water. 4, 5, 6. Around her, the crowd shifted. Whispers rippled outward like rings in still water. Phones tilted. Angles changed. Somewhere behind her, security was pushing through, but there were too many bodies and not enough urgency, and every second Royce Callahan's brain went without oxygen was a second that couldn't be bought back. Someone behind her said loud enough to be heard, "Is she even doing it right?" Wren didn't react. She couldn't afford to. She fixed her eyes on a patch of leather on Royce's vest, a faded eagle stitched in gold thread, and she used it as an anchor. Press, release, press, release. The rhythm was everything. The rhythm was the rope. The rhythm was the only thing between this man and the dark. 28, 29, 30. She tilted his head back, pinched his nose, sealed her mouth over his and breathed. Once, twice, watching his chest rise and fall with air that was hers, not his. Then her hands were back. 1, 2, 3. Sweat ran down her forehead and into her eyes. Her shoulders screamed. Her arms burned with a fire that started in her biceps and spread downward into her wrists. She was 19 years old and she weighed 120 pounds. And she had not eaten a real meal in 2 days, and none of that mattered because the count was everything. And the count did not stop. She was 14 years old again, kneeling on a living room floor with brown carpet and a window that let in too much afternoon light. Her father across from her, his hands placed on a borrowed CPR dummy with a cracked plastic face. His voice calm and patient and sure. "Your hands can bring someone back, Wren. Never forget that." She hadn't forgotten. Her father's name was Thomas Maddox. He had been a paramedic for 15 years in Jefferson County, Tennessee. The kind of paramedic who came home at 3 in the morning smelling like antiseptic and sweat and never once complained about it. The kind who brought home stories not about the people he lost, but about the ones he saved. The kind who believed that knowledge was something you passed down, not something you kept. He died when Wren was 14. A drunk driver ran a red light on Route 11 at 9:47 on a Tuesday evening, and Thomas Maddox's ambulance took the hit on the driver's side. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The paramedic who tried to save him was his own partner, a man named Bill, who came to the funeral and couldn't speak and left before the service was over. After that, time split in two. There was the before, when Wren's mother hummed while she cooked dinner, and the house smelled like garlic and clean laundry, and her father's boots sat by the front door like a promise that he would always come back. And there was the after. Her mother, Catherine Maddox, did not survive the grief. She survived the funeral in the first month and the second month, and then something inside her cracked open, and what poured in was not sadness, but emptiness, and the emptiness demanded to be filled. Alcohol first, then pills, then whatever was available, whatever could make the house stop feeling like a museum of a man who wasn't coming back. Wren watched it happen, slowly, and then all at once, the way her mother herself would later describe it, in a moment of terrible clarity that came too late to matter. The bills stopped being paid, the house got cold, the food ran out and was replaced by bottles. Wren learned to cook at 15, not because she wanted to, but because no one else was going to. She learned to forge her mother's signature on school forms. She learned to clean up vomit at 2 in the morning without crying, and then she learned to cry later alone in a closet with the door closed. Catherine Maddox died when Wren was 16. An overdose. Not intentional, the coroner said, which was the kind of distinction that only matters to people who write reports. To Wren, standing in a hospital hallway in shoes that were too small because no one had thought to buy her new ones, the distinction between accidental and intentional meant nothing. Her mother was dead. The house was empty, and Wren was 16 years old with no parents, no money, and a grief so heavy it pressed the air out of her lungs every time she tried to breathe. The system moved her. That was what the system did. It moved children from place to place like furniture that didn't quite fit any room. First, her mother's sister, Aunt Karen, who lived in a double wide outside of Knoxville and had 3 children of her own and a husband who drank too much and a tolerance for extra people that lasted exactly 4 months before it wore through like cheap fabric. Then a distant cousin in North Carolina who agreed to take her because the state was offering a stipend and who treated Wren like a tenant who hadn't paid rent. Then her father's brother, Uncle Dale in Roanoke. He was the last one. The one who looked at Wren on her 18th birthday and said, "You're an adult now. I've done what I could." The door closed behind her at 8 in the morning on a cold March day, and the street opened up in front of her like a mouth. She had been on her own ever since. 18 months of shelters and bus stations and rest stops and library floors, and finally the Ridgewood Galleria, which had warm air and public bathrooms and a parking garage with stairwells where the security cameras didn't reach. 6 months she had lived there. 6 months of making herself invisible. Of learning that a young woman alone draws attention she cannot afford. Of folding herself into corners and counting the hours between meals and telling herself that this was temporary, that something would change, that the world had not completely forgotten about her. Most days she didn't believe it, but she kept going because her father had taught her something else besides CPR. He had taught her that you don't stop. Even when your arms are burning and your body is screaming and every part of you wants to quit, you don't stop. You keep pressing. You keep counting. You keep breathing for someone else until they can breathe for themselves. 28, 29, 30. 2 breaths again. Her arms were failing. The muscles in her shoulders had gone from burning to numb, and the numbness was worse because it meant she couldn't feel how hard she was pressing, couldn't calibrate the depth, couldn't trust her own body to do what it needed to do. Sweat dripped from her chin onto Royce's vest. The crowd noise had become a distant roar like traffic heard through a closed window. 1, 2, 3, and then it happened. Royce Callahan's body jerked beneath her hands, a sharp, violent motion like a machine catching on a gear it had missed. His chest convulsed once, and a sound tore out of him that was barely human, a ragged, guttural gasp that sounded like air being ripped from a place it had already abandoned. His eyes widened, unfocused, willed, terrified. His hands clawed at the tile. His chest heaved once, twice, and on the third time his lungs caught, and the breath that came out of him was wet and awful and beautiful. The crowd made a sound, a collective intake of breath, 200 people remembering how to breathe at the same time. Someone clapped, someone sobbed, someone said, "Oh my God," in a voice that cracked on every syllable. Wren froze just for a moment, half a second, long enough to watch the color begin to return to his lips, to see his chest rise and fall on its own, to confirm that the thing she had been fighting for was real and not a hallucination born of exhaustion and desperation. Then hands were on her shoulders, voices beside her, close professional already taking over. Paramedics dropped into position with the practiced efficiency of people who do this for a living. Oxygen mask, monitors, commands fired in short clip bursts that Wren recognized from a childhood spent listening to her father talk about his shifts. Royce was lifted onto a gurney, straps pulled tight, wheels locking and unlocking as they turned toward the exit. The crowd parted and the paramedics moved through the gap like water through a broken dam, fast and focused and already looking ahead. And Wren stood up. She stood up the way she did everything, quietly, without announcement, without expectation. She took one step backward, then another. Her bare feet were cold and her arms were shaking, and there was a taste in her mouth like copper and exhaustion. No one stopped her. No one turned to her and said, "Thank you." No one reached out a hand or asked her name or offered her a glass of water. The crowd was already reshaping itself, filling the space where Royce had been, phones being pocketed, conversations resuming, the machinery of ordinary life grinding back into motion. By the time the gurney disappeared through the mall's east exit, Wren Maddox was gone, swallowed by the crowd, folded back into the margins. Heading toward the stairwell on the 3rd level of the parking garage, where a thin blanket and a backpack with a broken zipper were waiting for her in the dark. She thought that was the end of it. Just another day of being nobody. She was wrong. Royce Callahan woke to the sound of machines, not the steady background hum of equipment at rest, but the sharp, insistent beeping of monitors that wanted his attention. His eyes opened slowly, then closed again. The light was too white. The air smelled like plastic and antiseptic. His body felt like it had been disassembled and put back together by someone working from memory. Tubes traced into his arms. A mask rested against his face, fogging with each breath. His chest ached with a dull, spreading pain that sat deeper than muscle, deeper than bone. It sat in the place where the heart lives, and it pulsed with every beat like a reminder that this organ, this machine he had ignored and abused and taken for granted for 58 years, had very nearly quit. A doctor appeared, calm, middle-aged, the kind of face that delivers serious news without flinching. "You had a sudden cardiac arrest," the doctor said. His voice was measured the way you speak to someone who is still deciding whether to be alive. "Your heart stopped in the food court of the Ridgewood Galleria. Someone initiated CPR within seconds. Without that intervention, you would have suffered severe brain damage or death." Royce stared at the ceiling. The words landed on him slowly, one at a time, each one heavier than the last. "Who?" he asked. His voice was rough, scraped raw. It didn't sound like his own. "We were hoping you could tell us," the doctor said. "You were alone when the paramedics arrived. The person who performed CPR left before anyone could identify them." Royce frowned. He searched his memory and found noise, light, pressure on his chest, and then nothing. A gap, a blank space where time should have been. "I don't remember anyone," he said. The doctor exchanged a look with the nurse standing near the door, a look that said they knew something he didn't. "You weren't alone," the doctor said quietly. "Someone knew exactly what to do." Later that evening, when Royce was strong enough to sit up without the room spinning, a hospital security officer wheeled in a small monitor on a metal cart. Mall footage. Overhead angle grainy, time-stamped in the corner. The image was distant, but the scene was unmistakable. The food court, the crowd, the circle of hesitation, and then from the edge of the frame, a figure moved. Small, fast, barefoot. Werewolf. The figure crossed the distance in seconds, dropping to their knees beside the body on the floor with a precision that didn't match their appearance. The angle was poor, but the movements were clear. Hands placed on the chest, elbows locked. Compressions beginning, immediately rhythmic, deliberate, relentless. Royce leaned forward. The ache in his chest pulled tight, but he didn't stop. He watched the figure on the screen press down again and again, shoulders pumping, head bowed, jaw clenched with an intensity that was visible even through the grainy footage. The compressions continued. 30, 2 breaths, 30 more. The crowd around them stood motionless, a ring of witnesses doing nothing. Then the body on the floor jerked. The figure on the screen paused, leaned back and watched. Paramedics entered the frame from the right. The figure stood up and walked away. Walked away barefoot into the crowd and disappeared from the frame without looking back. Royce stared at the paused image. The figure was frozen mid-step, half-turned from the camera. A girl, young, thin shoulders, hair pulled back, no shoes, a backpack hanging from one shoulder. She was already gone when the paramedics turned around. The security officer said, "No one got her name. A few people said they thought she might be homeless. She'd been seen around the mall before, but nobody knows who she is." Royce didn't take his eyes off the screen. The image blurred slightly, and he realized his eyes were wet. Not from the pain in his chest, from something else, something he hadn't felt in 4 years. Not since the phone call, not since Derek. Derek Callahan had been 22 years old. He had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness and a laugh that could fill a garage. He rode a Harley Sportster he'd rebuilt himself in his father's shop, every bolt tightened by his own hands. He was going to take over the business someday. That was the plan. That was always the plan. The accident happened on a Saturday. A wet road, a curve taken too fast, a guardrail that didn't hold. Derek was pronounced dead before the helicopter could land. Royce was 40 minutes away, working under a bike in the shop radio, playing completely unaware that the world was ending. After that, everything stopped. Royce's wife had left years before, unable to survive the combination of his stubbornness and his devotion to the club. Derek had been the only thing that remained. The only evidence that Royce Callahan's life had produced something worth keeping. And when Derek died, the purpose went with him. Royce stepped down as president of the Iron Wolves, the motorcycle club he had led for 12 years. He stopped riding. He stopped eating properly. He stopped going to the doctor because the doctor would tell him his heart was failing and he didn't care enough to hear it. The shop survived on momentum, on reputation, on the loyalty of customers who had been coming for 20 years. But Royce ran it the way a man runs a clock that's winding down, going through the motions, waiting for the spring to give out. He had been waiting for 4 years, and now lying in a hospital bed with tubes in his arms and a second chance he hadn't asked for, he was staring at a frozen image of a barefoot girl who had given him that chance without knowing anything about him, without knowing about Derek, without knowing about the shop or the club or the years of slow surrender. She had dropped to her knees and pressed her hands against his chest and counted out loud while 100 people stood and watched, and then she had walked away without a word. "Find her," Royce said. The security officer hesitated. "Sir, she appears to be homeless. No shoes, no identification. She left before anyone could speak to her. We don't have a name, a phone number, anything." Royce turned his head and looked at the man with eyes that had spent 20 years leading men who feared nothing. "Find her anyway." The search began that night. Royce Callahan had spent 2 decades in a world where loyalty was currency and silence was a virtue. The Iron Wolves were not a large club, but they were tight, and the men who wore the patch understood that when a brother asked for something, you didn't question it. You moved. Word went out through the channels Royce still had, phone calls made from hospital beds, text messages sent to numbers that hadn't been dialed in years. Brothers who had respected his silence for 4 years suddenly heard his voice again, and the voice said, "One thing, I need to find someone." They moved, mud and leather in patches, in hoodies and ball caps and plain clothes, walking through neighborhoods, standing on corners, asking questions in voices that were quieter than people expected. They showed the screenshot from the security footage, a blurry image of a barefoot girl kneeling on a tile floor. "Have you seen her? Have you seen this girl?" Most people shrugged. Some said maybe. A few said they thought they'd seen someone like that near the mall, near the bus station, near the overpass on Route 9. None of it led anywhere. The video spread. "I am." Someone posted the security footage online with a caption that read, "Does anyone know the barefoot angel?" The clip was 11 seconds long. It showed the girl dropping to her knees, beginning compressions, and then standing up and walking away. 11 seconds that contained more courage than most people demonstrate in a lifetime. Local news picked it up first, then regional, then the networks. The footage played on a loop while anchors talked about heroes and good Samaritans and the bystander effect, and how one person's actions can mean the difference between life and death. They used phrases like miracle and angel and ordinary hero, and they showed the blurry screenshot again and again, the barefoot girl frozen mid-compression, her face turned just enough from the camera to remain anonymous. The story grew legs, and Ren saw it. She was standing in the electronics store on the second level, the one with the wall of televisions mounted in a perfect grid. She went there sometimes in the late afternoons when the staff was busy and the store was crowded enough that one more body didn't register. The heat from the screens warmed her face. The sound was turned low and she usually didn't pay attention to what was playing. But this time something caught her eye. A food court, a crowd, a tile floor she recognized, and then a figure she recognized more because it was her. Blurry, hunched, unmistakable. Her hands on a stranger's chest. Her bare feet on the tile. Her hair falling from its knot. The count visible in the rhythm of her shoulders even through the grainy footage. Her stomach dropped. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Search continues for barefoot angel who saved biker's life." The man had lived. She could see that in the graphics that followed. A photograph of Royce Callahan sitting up in a hospital bed looking directly into the camera with an expression that said he was not finished yet. Below it a phone number, a tip line. "If you have any information about the identity of the young woman in this footage, please call." For one moment, standing in the blue glow of 30 television screens, Ren felt something she hadn't felt in months, pride. A small, warm thing flickering in her chest like a match struck in a dark room. She had done something. She had saved someone. The man was alive because her father had taught her what to do, and she had done it. Then fear crushed it. The pride lasted 2 seconds. The fear lasted longer. Because Ren Maddox had outstanding warrants, loitering, trespassing, unpaid fines from tickets she had received for sleeping in places where sleeping was not allowed. Small charges, the crimes of being poor in a country that treats poverty like a misdemeanor, but charges nonetheless, active, on file, attached to her name, and she was a young woman, alone with no one to vouch for her, no address, no phone, no record of anything except the various ways the system had processed and discarded her. Attention did not lead to help for people like Ren. Attention led to questions. Questions led to databases. Databases led to courtrooms and holding cells in the slow grinding machinery of institutions that had never once worked in her favor. She pulled her hood up and backed away from the television wall. A security guard walked past. His eyes swept the store, and for one terrible moment they lingered on her. Not with recognition, just with the reflexive suspicion that young people with backpacks and no shoes generate in places where everything is for sale. Ren turned, walked, didn't run because running draws attention. She moved through the store at exactly the speed of someone who belongs there, someone browsing, someone killing time, and she slipped out the side entrance and into the parking garage and down 2 flights of stairs to the stairwell where she slept. She sat on her blanket with her back against the concrete wall and pressed her hands against her face and breathed. The mall changed after that. A news crew set up near the food court, lights and microphones and cables taped across the floor. Witnesses were interviewed. Most said the same thing. They didn't know her. They hadn't noticed her. She appeared out of nowhere. A woman with a smoothie said she thought the girl might work at one of the stores. A teenager said he had a video on his phone, but it only showed the back of her head. Ren watched from behind pillars, from reflections in glass, from the gaps between crowds. She timed her movements between camera sweeps. She avoided the food court entirely. Twice she nearly crossed paths with people holding printed screenshots of her face. Once she ducked into a restroom and stood in a locked stall for 20 minutes, breathing shallow, listening for footsteps, her heart beating so loud she was sure someone would hear it. 3 days passed. The story didn't die. If anything, it grew. The mystery of the barefoot angel became the kind of story people shared because it made them feel something. Hope, guilt, the quiet discomfort of wondering whether they would have moved or stood still. And then on the third night, a woman named Dorothy Haskell picked up the phone. Dot Haskell was 50 years old. She had worked a late shift at the Ridgewood Galleria for 9 years, cleaning tables and mopping floors and watching the mall empty itself every night of people who had homes to go to. She had bad knees and strong hands and a face that didn't smile often, but meant it when it did. She had noticed Ren long before anyone else did, not all at once, in pieces, the way you notice a cat that keeps appearing in the same alley. First the shoes, or the lack of them. Then the backpack, always the same one fraying at the seams. Then the way the girl moved through the food court, like she was trying to take up as little space as possible, as if her body was an apology for existing. Dot never asked her name. She never asked why she was there. She understood without needing to be told that questions were a luxury this girl could not afford. So instead, she did what she could. A wrapped sandwich left on the edge of a trash can positioned too carefully to be garbage. A cup of coffee forgotten near a condiment station at closing time. Small things, invisible things, the kind of kindness that doesn't ask for gratitude because gratitude would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would require a conversation, and a conversation would make the whole fragile arrangement collapse. When Dot saw the footage on the news, she recognized the girl immediately. The shoulders, the way she moved, the bare feet. She stood in front of her television for a long time, dish towel in her hands, and her hands were shaking. Then she called the number on the screen. Royce Callahan answered on the second ring. "I know her," Dot said. Her voice was quick words tumbling over each other, the voice of someone who has made a decision and is afraid she'll lose the nerve to follow through. "She sleeps in the parking garage stairwell, 3rd level, near the broken fire door that doesn't latch." There was a pause. Then Royce's voice, raw and eager. "I'll go tonight." "Wait," Dot said, and her voice changed, became firmer, slower. The voice of a woman who had spent years watching a young girl survive alone and understood things that Royce Callahan, for all his strength and loyalty, could not. "You can't go alone," she said. You're a strange man going into a dark parking garage to find a young girl who's been living alone for 6 months. Think about what that looks like. Think about what that feels like to her. The silence that followed was long enough to matter. I'll go with you, Dot said. She knows me, or at least she knows I'm not a threat. If you show up alone, she'll run, and you won't catch her. Trust me. They went together, 11 o'clock at night. The parking garage was nearly empty, the concrete swallowing sound, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, with the tired persistence of things that have been running too long. Dot led the way. She walked slowly, her bad knees protesting on the incline, but she didn't stop. She knew the stairwell. She had passed it 100 times on her way to her car, and every time she had glanced toward the broken door and wondered if the girl was still there. The stairwell was dark. The fluorescent tube on the landing had burned out weeks ago and no one had replaced it. In the shadows, a shape shifted. A backpack. A thin blanket folded with the precision of someone who has learned that the only things you own must be kept in perfect order. Bare feet pulled back. Wren saw them before they saw her. Two figures, one large moving slowly, one smaller familiar. The scent of floor cleaner and coffee. Dot. But the other one, the man, big, leather, boots on concrete, every muscle in her body coiled. Easy, honey, Dot said softly. She didn't step forward. She stood at the base of the stairs, hands visible, voice low. It's just me, and this is the man you saved. He wanted to find you. He just wants to talk. Wren's eyes moved from Dot to Royce and back. Her hand gripped the strap of her backpack so tightly her knuckles went white. I don't want anything, Wren said. The words came fast, defensive, the way you speak when you've rehearsed every possible version of this conversation, and none of them end well. Royce raised his hands, palms out, slow, deliberate, the gesture of a man who understood that trust was not something you demanded. I just needed to find you, he said. His voice cracked on the last word, and the crack surprised him. Silence stretched between the three of them. The garage hummed. A car alarm beeped somewhere on a lower level, distant and irrelevant. Why did you do it? Royce asked. You didn't know me. Wren looked away. For a moment in the dim light, she looked younger than 19. She looked like the 14-year-old girl kneeling on a living room floor learning from her father how to bring someone back. Because everyone else just watched, she said quietly. My dad taught me. You don't just watch. The words landed in the stairwell like stones dropped into water. Royce's eyes adjusted to the dark. He saw what the cameras hadn't captured. The wear on the backpack, the blanket too thin for the season, the bare feet on concrete that never warmed, the careful way she held herself tight and guarded like a door that had been opened too many times by the wrong people. This wasn't a kid passing through hard times. This was survival stripped to its essentials. And the girl who had saved his life with hands that hadn't held a warm meal in days was looking at him like he was one more thing the world might use to hurt her. Royce swallowed. His chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with his heart condition. Dot spoke next. She didn't move closer. She just spoke the same way she left sandwiches on the edge of trash cans. Carefully, without pressure, without forcing the girl to make a decision she wasn't ready to make. He owns a motorcycle repair shop, Dot said. There's a room above it. He needs help with the work. She paused. She looked at Wren with eyes that had been watching her for 6 months. You saved his life, honey. Let him try to help with yours. Wren shook her head. Not a refusal, a disbelief, the automatic response of someone who has heard promises before and learned that promises are just words that haven't broken yet. Royce spoke carefully. There's a living space above the shop. Small, nothing fancy. It's been sitting empty. He paused. I've had heart problems. Can't do 12-hour days under a bike anymore. Work's been piling up. I could use the help. And you could use a place to sleep. He looked at her bare feet, then back at her face. No strings, he said. No questions about your past. I don't need explanations. If you want, I can teach you the trade. And maybe you could get your GED. Think about what comes next. Wren laughed once, short and sharp like a blade being drawn. A sound that had no humor in it, only the armored reflex of someone bracing for disappointment. Why would you do this? She asked. Royce didn't answer right away. He looked at the stairwell, at the blanket, at the darkness this girl had carved into a home because the world had given her nothing else. Because you didn't hesitate, he said. You saw someone who needed help and you moved. That's rare. That's worth everything. Ren looked at Dot. Dot didn't nod, didn't push, just stood there, the only person in 6 months who had consistently been kind without asking for anything in return. If I do this, Ren said slowly, you have Dot's number and she has mine. If anything happens, if anything goes wrong, done, Royce said. Dot nodded. Already done, honey. Ren stood there for a long time. She looked at the stairwell behind her, the blanket, the backpack, the concrete walls that had kept her alive but had never let her live. She thought about her father's hands guiding hers years ago on a living room floor that no longer existed. She thought about the man on the tile whose chest had risen under her palms. She thought about the sound of his first breath, ragged and desperate and alive. What if I mess it up? She asked. The question was barely a whisper. Then we deal with it together, Royce said. Ren nodded once, small, careful, the nod of someone who has been burned too many times to trust the flame, but is cold enough to treat. I'll try, she said. She picked up her backpack. She folded her blanket. She followed them out of the stairwell and into the garage and through the exit doors and into the night air, which was cool and smelled like rain and tasted like something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Something that might, if she was very careful, turn out to be the beginning. The first morning, Ren didn't come downstairs. Royce stood at the base of the staircase with 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with enough sugar to make a dentist wince, and he listened. Above him, the small apartment was silent. Not the silence of sleep, the silence of someone lying very still, deciding whether or not the world on the other side of the door was worth opening up to. He set her cup on the 3rd step and went to the shop. By the time she appeared, the coffee was cold. She stood in the doorway between the staircase and the garage, backpack on one shoulder, blanket folded under her arm, as if she might need to leave at any moment. Her eyes scanned the space the way prey animals scan open ground. Exits first, then threats, then everything else. Royce was under a Harley Road King, only his boots visible. He didn't look up. There's cereal in the cabinet above the sink, he said. Bowls are to the left. Milk's in the fridge if it hasn't turned. He said it the way you say pass the salt. No weight, no expectation. Just information offered to a person who could take it or leave it. Ren stood there for 11 seconds. Then she set her backpack on the floor near the door, walked to the small kitchen at the back of the shop and poured herself a bowl of cereal. She ate standing up, her back to the wall facing the exit. That was day 1. The first 30 days did not feel like a rescue. They felt like 2 people circling each other in a space that was too small for strangers and too new for trust. Ren slept on the floor of the apartment above the shop for the first 9 nights. The bed was there, a twin mattress with clean sheets that Royce had put on the day before, and she couldn't use it. The softness felt wrong. The stillness felt wrong. Her body, which had spent 6 months calibrating itself to concrete and cold, and the constant vigilance of sleeping in places where sleep was dangerous, refused to surrender to comfort. She woke at every sound. The creak of the building settling, the distant rumble of a truck on the highway, the tick of the radiator cycling on and off. Each noise triggered the same response, a jolt of adrenaline, a tightening of every muscle, a split second where she was already calculating the fastest route to the door before her conscious mind could remind her that she was safe. Safe. The word felt foreign. She turned it over in her mind, the way you turn over a coin you found on the street, examining it for defects, waiting for it to reveal itself as counterfeit. Royce didn't push. That was the thing about him that took the longest to understand. He had spent 20 years leading men who respected strength and directness, and yet with Ren, he moved with a patience that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than personality. He left space, literal space. He kept the shop door open during the day so she never felt trapped. He announced himself when he came up the stairs, a deliberate clearing of the throat, or a knock on the door frame that said, "I'm here, but I'm not coming in unless you want me to." Mornings began with coffee. For the first 2 weeks, they drank it on opposite sides of the counter. The distance between them measured not in feet, but in years of damage and distrust. Royce read a motorcycle magazine. Ren stared at a spot on the wall. Neither of them spoke much. The silence was not hostile. It was cautious, the silence of 2 animals sharing a watering hole each aware of the other, each waiting to see what the other would do. The first lesson came on day 4. Royce walked her through an oil change on a 2004 Softail. Nothing glamorous, nothing complicated, just the fundamental act of draining what was old and replacing it with what was new. He showed her once, then he stepped back and let her do it. Ren's hands were steady, not the forced steadiness of someone trying to appear calm, but the natural steadiness of hands that had been trained to work under pressure. She drained the oil, replaced the filter, refilled the reservoir. She didn't rush. She checked the level twice. When she was done, she wiped her hands on a rag and looked at Royce with an expression that was part question, part defiance. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow we'll do brakes." He turned away before she could see the look on his face, but she saw it anyway, reflected in the chrome of the bike beside her. Something that might have been recognition, something that might have been pain. The lessons built on each other the way bricks build a wall. Oil changes became brake pads. Brake pads became tire replacements. Tire replacements became chain adjustments. And chain adjustments became the beginning of something Ren hadn't felt since her father was alive. Competence. The specific grounding satisfaction of knowing how to do something well. Royce taught the way Thomas Maddox had taught, not by lecturing, but by showing. He placed tools in her hands and let her feel the resistance of a bolt that was too tight. He had her listen to engines, eyes closed, ears tuned to the frequencies that told the story of what was happening inside. "This one's running rich," he'd say. Hear it, that hesitation in the idle? She'd close her eyes and listen, and after a while she could hear it, the machine speaking to her in a language she was learning to understand. By the 3rd week, Ren was handling minor repairs on her own. Her work was meticulous. Where Royce had the speed of 30 years of muscle memory, Ren had something else. Precision born from the knowledge that everything she had could be taken away. Every bolt she tightened was tightened correctly because she couldn't afford for it not to be. Every part she replaced was double-checked because she had spent too long in a world where one wrong move meant losing everything. Customers noticed. At first they were surprised. A young woman in a mechanic's bay grease on her forearms, a wrench in her hand, crawling under bikes that weighed 3 times what she did. A few asked questions that were more about doubt than curiosity. "She knows what she's doing. Is she, qualified?" Royce answered the same way every time. "She's better than I was at her age, and I was pretty damn good." The doubt faded, not because Royce said so, but because the work spoke for itself. Bikes came back running cleaner, jobs were finished on time. The young woman at Callahan's shop treated every machine like it mattered because she understood something most mechanics learned only after years in the trade. A motorcycle wasn't just metal and gasoline. It was someone's freedom, someone's escape, someone's Sunday morning on the back roads with the wind in their face and the world falling away behind them. She understood that because she had spent 19 years without freedom of her own. Dorothy Haskell came by on a Thursday evening 3 weeks in carrying a casserole dish and the particular expression of a woman who was checking on something she cared about without wanting to make a fuss about it. She set the casserole on the workbench, surveyed the shop with the practiced eye of someone who notices everything, and then looked at Ren. "You eating?" Ren nodded, sleeping. "Getting there." Dot studied her for a moment. Then she pulled up a stool and sat down and started talking about the mall, about the new pretzel franchise that had replaced the old one and how the pretzels weren't as good, about the leak in the food court ceiling that maintenance kept promising to fix, about the security guard on the 2nd level who had started bringing his dog to work, a beagle named Captain, that slept behind the information desk. She talked about ordinary things in an ordinary voice, and the ordinariness of it settled over Ren like a blanket that wasn't too heavy and wasn't too thin. Dot didn't ask about the stairwell. She didn't ask about the past. She didn't offer pity or advice or the particular brand of aggressive helpfulness that made Ren feel like a broken thing being repaired. She just showed up, with food and conversation in the steady, undemanding presence of someone who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do for another person is be boring. Dot came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. It became a rhythm. Casserole or soup or sandwiches wrapped in foil, eaten at the workbench, while Dot talked and Ren listened, and Royce sat in his chair near the office door and occasionally grunted in agreement with something Dot said. For Ren, who had not had a regular visitor since her father was alive, the rhythm was disorienting at first. She kept waiting for the pattern to break, for Dot to miss a week. for the food to stop coming, for the conversation to turn subtly into the kind of transaction that every relationship in Ren's life had eventually become. I helped you, so now you owe me. I was kind, so now you belong to me. But Dot never turned. She never asked for anything. She never mentioned the footage, or the news stories, or the phrase barefoot angel that still circulated online. She just showed up. And eventually Ren stopped waiting for her to stop. The GED program started on a Monday morning in a community education building 4 miles from the shop. Fluorescent lights, plastic chairs, the smell of old carpet, and institutional coffee. Ren sat in the back row, backpack on the empty chair beside her, posture rigid, scanning the room for exits before she looked at the whiteboard. The instructor was a woman named Pam, who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke with the flat, practical cadence of someone who had been teaching adults for 20 years and had stopped being surprised by anything. She handed Ren a placement test and a pencil and said, "Take your time." Ren finished in 40 minutes. The results came back higher than expected. Strong in reading comprehension, solid in science, weak in math, specifically algebra, which she had missed during the years when school was a luxury her home life couldn't support. She studied at night. After the shop closed and Royce went upstairs and the building grew quiet, Ren spread her textbooks across the workbench and worked by the light of the fluorescent tubes overhead. The same light that illuminated engines and transmissions during the day now fell on equations and essays and the slow, stubborn process of reclaiming an education that had been interrupted by grief. She whispered answers to herself. She reworked problems 3 and 4 times, erasing until the paper wore thin. She read chapters about American history and biology and earth science subjects she had once known in the half-hearted way of a teenager sitting in a classroom she didn't want to be in, and she found that they meant something different now. Now they were doors, small ones, narrow ones, but doors nonetheless. Each fact she memorized, each concept she understood, was a step away from the stairwell and towards something she couldn't see yet, but was beginning to believe existed. Royce found her asleep at the workbench one morning, face pressed against an open algebra textbook, a pencil still loosely held in her fingers. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, coffee in hand, and he thought about Derek, who had sat at this same bench 10 years ago doing homework. He complained about, surrounded by tools he loved. The memory was sharp and sweet and unbearable. He turned away and went back upstairs and didn't mention it. 6 weeks in the shop had found its rhythm. Ren opened the bay doors at 7. Royce came down at 8. Coffee, silence, work. Lunch was sandwiches eaten over the engine. They were working on conversations about torque specs and valve clearances that gradually expanded to include other things. Music, weather, the particular insanity of highway drivers who didn't check blind spots. Royce had paperwork drawn up in the 4th week. A proper rental agreement for the apartment above the shop, legal, and documented with Ren's name and his name, and a monthly rent of $1, which was the minimum amount the lawyer said was necessary to make the arrangement legitimate. He helped her file for a replacement state ID, a process that involved 3 visits to the DMV, 2 phone calls to records offices in Tennessee, and the specific kind of patience required to navigate a bureaucracy designed for people who already had what they needed. The ID arrived in the mail on a Tuesday. Ren held it in her hands and stared at it for a long time. A small rectangle of plastic with her photograph and her name, and an address that was not a stairwell or a parking garage or the street. Royce gave her a phone the same week. Prepaid, simple, nothing fancy. She programmed 3 numbers into it. Royce, Dot, Pam, her GED instructor. 3 numbers, more than she'd had in over a year. Then on a Wednesday afternoon that had been ordinary in every way, a black pickup truck pulled into the lot outside the shop. The engine idled for a long time before the driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was 55, lean, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since been weathered into something harder. He wore a plain leather jacket, no patches, no insignia, but the way he moved the set of his shoulders, the deliberate pace of his walk, said Motorcycle Club. Louder than any patch could. Vincent Hale. The men who had ridden with him called him Viper, and the name fit. Not because he was fast, though he was, because he was patient, because he waited, because when he struck, it came from a direction you weren't watching. 5 years ago, Royce Callahan had discovered that Viper was running methamphetamine through a network of contacts connected to the Iron Wolves. Not sanctioned by the club, not known to the membership. A private enterprise using the club's name and reputation as cover. Royce had confronted him at a table in the clubhouse in front of 12 men who had earned their patches the honest way, and he had stripped Viper of his position, his patch, and his membership. In the time it took to drink a cup of coffee, Viper had walked out without a word. That silence had lasted 5 years. Now he stood in the parking lot of Callahan's motorcycle repair looking at the building the way a man looks at something he intends to own. Royce saw him through the shop window. He set down his wrench, slowly, deliberately, the way you set down a tool when you need your hands free. "Stay here," he said to Wren. Wren looked up from the brake assembly she was inspecting. She saw Royce's face and understood immediately that something had changed. She didn't ask questions. She stayed. Royce walked outside. The two men faced each other across 10 feet of cracked asphalt and 5 years of unresolved history. Royce Viper said. He smiled the way a knife smiles when it catches the light. "You look like hell. What do you want?" Vincent Viper glanced at the shop, then at the apartment windows above it, then back at Royce. "Heard you had some trouble. Heart gave out in a mall, that right?" He paused. "Also heard you got a new house guest. Young girl. Real young." The implication landed exactly where it was aimed. Royce didn't flinch. His voice dropped into the register that men who had known him for 20 years recognized as the last warning before things got very quiet or very loud. "Say what you came to say," he said. Viper raised his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just a concerned citizen, looking out for the community." He paused, letting the performance settle. "Actually, I've been thinking about this property. Good location. Growing area. Could do a lot with it." He looked at the shop again, measuring it with his eyes. "I'd make a fair offer. Not for sale. Everything's for sale, Royce. Especially when the owner's one heartbeat away from the grave and the only employee is a runaway he picked up in a parking garage." Royce stepped closer. Not threatening. Present. The way he had stood in the stairwell when he found Wren. The way he had stood in the clubhouse when he stripped Viper's patch. "The shop's not for sale," he said. "And you're not welcome here. That hasn't changed in 5 years." Viper studied him. The smile didn't leave, but it hardened. Then he glanced up at the shop window where Wren was visible behind the glass watching. "Pretty thing," he said softly. "Bet there's a story there." He turned and walked back to his truck. The engine started. The tires crunched on gravel. He pulled out slowly, taking his time because men like Viper understood that slowness was its own kind of threat. Royce stood in the lot until the truck disappeared. Then he went back inside. "Who was that?" Wren asked. "Nobody," Royce said. But Wren had spent 6 months reading people the way other people read signs. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands weren't quite steady, the particular quality of anger that lives in a man who has been threatened, not with violence but with patience. She didn't press, but she didn't forget. 2 weeks later, the internet turned. It started with a post on a local community page. A screenshot of Wren's face pulled from the security footage, placed beside a screenshot of a county court database showing outstanding citations under the name Wren Maddox, loitering, trespassing, failure to appear. The caption read, "This your barefoot angel, she's got a record." And she's living with a 58-year-old man she met in a parking garage. Anyone else think this smells wrong? The post was anonymous. The account had been created 3 days earlier. It had no other activity. It didn't matter. The algorithm did what algorithms do. It found the people most likely to react and put the post in front of them. Within 48 hours, it had been shared over 400 times. Comments accumulated like debris after a flood. Some were sympathetic, most were not. "She's a con artist. Probably planned the whole thing. Who lives in a mall for 6 months? That's not homeless. That's crazy. The old guy should know better. What kind of man takes in a teenage girl he doesn't know?" And the word that appeared again and again, repeated with the confidence of people who had never met either of them. Fraud. Wren saw the post on her phone at 10 o'clock on a Friday night, sitting at the workbench with her algebra textbook open and a half-eaten sandwich beside her. She read the first comment, then the second, then the 10th. Her face didn't change. That was something the streets had given her. The ability to absorb impact without showing it. But inside, something old and heavy shifted. The familiar weight of being judged by people who didn't know her, of being reduced to a category, a headline, a collection of assumptions stacked so high that the actual person underneath became invisible. She closed the phone and put it face down on the bench. She stared at the wall. Then she stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot, which was dark and empty and quiet, in the way that parking lots are quiet at night. And she thought about the stairwell in the Ridgewood Galleria, which was also dark and empty and quiet, and which had never asked her to justify her existence. She didn't sleep that night. Royce saw the post the next morning. One of the Iron Wolves called to tell him. Then another, then a third. By noon, Royce had read enough to understand the shape of what was happening. This wasn't organic. The timing, the anonymous account, the specific detail of Wren's court records, things that required effort to find. This was directed. Someone had done research. Someone had constructed a narrative and launched it with precision. He thought about the black pickup truck in his parking lot, the smile that caught the light like a knife. Royce made 2 phone calls. The first was to his lawyer. The second was to a brother in the Iron Wolves who worked in IT and knew how to trace things that people thought were untraceable. The connection to Leland Price surfaced within a week. Price, the operations manager at the Ridgewood Galleria, had accessed the mall's internal incident reports the day after Viper's visit to the shop. Reports that included Wren's description, her approximate location within the mall, and a security notation from 8 months prior when she had been identified as a person of interest for repeated presence without purchases. Price had passed this information to someone. Phone records showed calls between Price and a number registered to a prepaid phone purchased at a gas station on Route 9, the same gas station that sat 3 miles from Vincent Hale's apartment. Royce didn't share this with Wren. Not yet. She had enough weight on her shoulders. He filed the information with his lawyer and waited because Royce Callahan understood something about men like Viper. They didn't stop. They escalated. And when they escalated, they made mistakes. The escalation came on a Tuesday, 6:15 in the morning. The sun wasn't up yet. The shop was dark. Wren was upstairs asleep on the bed now, not the floor, though she still kept her shoes beside it and her backpack within arm's reach. The knock was sharp, official, the kind of knock that comes from a fist trained to announce authority. Royce opened the door in a flannel shirt and jeans, coffee not yet made, the exhaustion of a man who no longer slept soundly visible in the lines around his eyes. 2 officers stood on the threshold. Behind them, a woman in plain clothes with a badge on her belt and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Lieutenant Sandra Marsh, Botetor County Sheriff's Department, 45 years old, sharp-featured, the kind of face that assessed situations the way a mechanic assesses engines, quickly, thoroughly, without sentiment. Mr. Callahan, Marsh said, "We've received a complaint regarding a person residing at this address. A welfare check has been requested." Royce's jaw tightened. "By whom?" "The complaint was filed through our anonymous tip line," Marsh said. She pulled a small notebook from her jacket. The caller expressed concern about a young woman living in what they described as, she read directly, an informal and potentially exploitative arrangement with an older male property owner. The words hit the morning air like stones. Royce felt the shape of it immediately. The careful language, the implication, the weapon disguised as concern. Someone had taken this most generous thing he had done in years and made it sound predatory. "She's my employee," Royce said. His voice was controlled, but the effort showed. "She lives in the apartment upstairs. She pays rent. There's a lease. We'd like to verify that," Marsh said, "and we'd like to speak with the young woman." There was a sound on the stairs. Both officers looked up. Marsh's eyes followed. Wren stood on the landing halfway down. She had heard the knock. She had heard the words. And every cell in her body was firing the same signal. Run. Run now. Run before they put you in a system that has never kept you safe. Run before questions become records, and records become handcuffs, and handcuffs become another room with a locked door and a stranger deciding your future. Her feet were bare. Her backpack was upstairs. The door was 15 feet away. She didn't run. She came down the stairs 1 step at a time. She stood beside Royce, shoulders straight, chin-level, hands at her sides. She looked at Lieutenant Marsh with eyes that were terrified and steady, At the same time, the eyes of someone who has decided to stand still, even though every survival instinct is screaming at her to move. "I'm Ren Maddox," she said. "I live here. I work here. No one is hurting me." Marsh studied her. The assessment was quick and thorough. She noted the clean clothes, the calloused hands, the body language that said fear but not abuse, the way Ren stood beside Royce, not behind him. "I understand," Marsh said. "We still need to verify your identification and run a standard background check." It's procedure. The background check was where it fell apart. Ren's name returned 2 outstanding citations. Loitering from 9 months ago when she had been found sleeping under an overpass in Roanoke. Trespassing from 7 months ago when a security guard at the Ridgewood Galleria had filed a report after finding her in a restricted area of the parking garage. Both charges had attached bench warrants for failure to appear. Small warrants, the legal system's version of an unpaid parking ticket, but warrants nonetheless. Marsh sat Ren down at the workbench, the same workbench where she studied algebra at night, and explained the situation with the dispassionate clarity of someone whose job required her to separate facts from feelings. "These are minor charges," Marsh said, "but they're active. They need to be addressed." Ren nodded. She didn't speak. Her hands were folded in her lap and they were shaking, but the shaking was invisible unless you knew to look. Royce's lawyer arrived within the hour. A man named Ed Harkins, 62, who wore suits that were 10 years out of fashion and spoke with the calm, unhurried authority of someone who had been navigating small-town legal systems since before Ren was born. He reviewed the charges. He reviewed the rental agreement. He asked Marsh for 24 hours to prepare a formal response. Marsh agreed. She left with the 2 officers and the shop felt hollow in their absence, the way a room feels after something heavy has been removed from it. Over the following week, Ed Harkins built a case. Not for a courtroom because the charges were too minor for trial. For a hearing, a simple proceeding where the circumstances behind the citations would be presented and a judge would decide whether to dismiss or pursue. Harkins gathered statements. From Dorothy Haskell, who described 6 months of leaving food for a young woman she recognized as someone in trouble. From Ren's GED instructor, Pam, who wrote 3 paragraphs about a student who showed up every day, who never missed a class, who studied harder than anyone she had taught in 15 years of adult education. From 4 regular customers of Callahan's shop, who described Ren's work as thorough, professional, and reliable. From 3 members of the Iron Wolves who had known Royce for decades and testified to his character without hesitation or reservation. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in a courtroom that smelled like floor wax and old wood. Ren wore clean jeans and a button-down shirt that Dot had bought her the day before and ironed that morning. She sat in the front row beside Royce, who wore a collared shirt for the first time in 4 years, and Ed Harkins, who wore the same suit he always wore. The judge was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the expression of someone who had heard 10,000 stories and was still willing to hear one more. Harkins presented the facts. The death of Thomas Maddox, paramedic. The subsequent death of Catherine Maddox. The series of temporary homes that ended with an 18-year-old being turned out onto the street with nothing. The 6 months of homelessness. The loitering charge, which amounted to a young woman sleeping in the only place she could find. The trespassing charge, which amounted to the same thing. Then he talked about the food court. He played the security footage on a small screen. The same 11 seconds that had been broadcast on television and shared online thousands of times. The barefoot girl dropping to her knees, the compressions, the counting, the man's chest rising, the girl standing up and walking away. The courtroom was quiet. Harkins called Ren to the stand. She walked to the front of the room with her hands at her sides and her jaw set. She sat down and looked at the judge and waited. Ms. Maddox, Harkins said, "Can you tell the court why you performed CPR on a stranger in the Ridgewood Galleria food court on July 14th? Ren was silent for a moment. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had pressed against a dying man's chest, the same hands that now held wrenches and textbooks in the fragile architecture of a life being rebuilt. "Because my father taught me," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear. "He was a paramedic. He died when I was 14. Before he died, he taught me that when someone needs help, you don't just watch, you move." She paused. "That's all I did. I moved." The judge asked her 3 questions. About her living situation, about her employment, about her plans. Wren answered each one directly without embellishment, without the defensive posture that had defined her interactions with authority for the previous 3 years. When it was over, the judge dismissed both charges. She did it quickly without drama, with the specific efficiency of someone who recognized that the system had failed this young woman enough times already and saw no purpose in adding to the count. Outside the courthouse in the pale morning light, Wren stood on the steps and breathed. The air tasted like early fall, sharp and clean. Dot was there, and Royce and Pam, and two of the Iron Wolves who had driven in that morning. Nobody said much. There was nothing to say that the morning hadn't already said. The charges were gone. The warrants were cleared. Wren Maddox existed for the first time in 3 years inside the system's records as something other than a problem to be processed. But the internet didn't know that. And the posts were still there. And the comments were still accumulating. And the narrative that someone had carefully constructed, the one about the con artist and the old man, and the arrangement that smelled wrong, was still spreading, carried by algorithms that rewarded outrage and punished nuance. Wren read the comments that night. She sat on her bed in the apartment above the shop phone, in her hands scrolling through words written by people who had never met her and never would. Words that reduced her to a category, a type, a cautionary tale. She's using him. Classic grifter. He'll regret it when she cleans him out. What kind of girl moves in with a stranger old enough to be her grandfather, and the one that hit hardest not because it was the cruelest, but because it was the closest to the fear she carried inside herself? She'll ruin everything she touches. People like that always do. People like that. 2 words that contained an entire worldview. 2 words that said your circumstances define you. Your past is your future. You were thrown away for a reason, and the reason is you. Wren set the phone down. She looked at the room, the bed she had finally learned to sleep in, the desk where her textbooks were stacked in the order she studied them, math on top because it was hardest, and she believed in starting with the hardest thing. The window that looked out over the parking lot where Royce's truck sat beside the garage. She pulled her backpack out from under the bed, the same backpack she had carried for 18 months, the same one she had carried into the stairwell and out of it and into this room that smelled like engine oil and possibility. She opened it and began to pack. Jeans, shirt, the blanket folded tight, her toothbrush, the small notebook where she kept her study notes. She moved quickly, efficiently, the practiced speed of someone who had packed to leave many times and knew exactly what she needed and what she could leave behind. She was at the door when she heard Royce on the stairs. He appeared on the landing, slowly the way he always did, announcing himself with the creak of the 4th step and the deliberate weight of his boots. He looked at her. He looked at the backpack on her shoulder. He looked at the door she was about to open. He didn't block her way. He didn't raise his voice. He leaned against the wall and crossed his arms and looked at her with the same expression he had worn in the parking garage stairwell the first night they met. Patient, present, unwilling to look away. "You going somewhere?" he asked. "I'm making things worse," Wren said. The words came out flat, rehearsed the way you deliver a line you've been practicing in your head for hours. The internet stuff, the kasut, the hearing, all of it's because of my schwaasume. If I leave, it stops. Royce was quiet for a moment. Then he shook his head. Not a dramatic shake, a small one. The kind that says, "I've heard the argument and I've rejected it." "Sit down," he said. Wren didn't sit. She stood with her hand on the doorknob and her feet pointed toward the exit, and every muscle in her body tense for departure. Royce looked at the floor. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Not softer exactly, deeper. The voice of a man reaching past his defenses into the place where the things he never talked about lived. "My son's name was Derek," he said. "He was 22. He had his mother's eyes and my stubborn streak, and he could rebuild a transmission faster than anyone I ever trained. He rode a Sportster he put together in this shop, every bolt, every wire. He was going to take over the business. That was the plan." He paused. His jaw worked. His eyes stayed on the floor. He died on a Saturday. Wet road, bad curve, guardrail that it didn't hold. "I was standing right where you're standing when I got the call. I went down those stairs and got in my truck and drove to the hospital, and they told me he was gone." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of 4 years of grief compressed into a space that couldn't hold it. After that, I stopped, Royce said. I stopped caring about the shop, stopped caring about the club, stopped caring about myself. My heart started failing, and I didn't go to the doctor because I didn't see the point. I was 54 years old, and I had nothing left that mattered enough to stay alive for. He looked up. His eyes met Ren's. Then you put your hands on my chest in a food court, and you brought me back. Not just my heart, all of it, everything I'd given up on. He straightened, his voice steadied. I couldn't save Derek. I tried. I tried everything, and I failed, and I have lived with that failure every single day for 4 years. He paused. I am not going to fail again. I am not going to watch someone walk out that door because the world decided she wasn't worth fighting for. He looked at the backpack on her shoulder. You can leave if you want, he said. That door isn't locked. It's never been locked. But you should know that if you walk through it, you're not saving me from trouble. You're taking the only thing I've got left that makes this shop, this life mean something. Ren stood at the door for a long time. The hallway light hummed, the building settled. Somewhere outside, a truck passed on the highway, its engine fading into the distance. She thought about the stairwell, the concrete, the cold, the slow erosion of days that led nowhere, and nights that ended in the same place they began. She thought about the food court and the sound of a heartbeat that wasn't hers and the feeling of her father's voice in her hands. She thought about Derek, 22 years old, a photograph on a wall, a sportster that no one would ride again. She set the backpack down. She didn't say, I'm staying. She didn't say, thank you. She didn't say anything that would make this moment into something clean and simple, because it wasn't clean and it wasn't simple. It was messy and painful and real. Two people standing in a hallway with too much damage between them and not enough words for any of it. She just took her hand off the doorknob and sat down on the top step of the stairs, and Royce sat down beside her, and they stayed there for a long time, not speaking, just present while the night moved on around them, and the shop waited below, patient and dark, full of machines that needed fixing, and a future that for the first time, neither of them was trying to run from. The next morning, Ren came downstairs early. She made 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with enough sugar to make a dentist wince. She set Royce's cup on the counter and opened the bay doors and started working on the first bike of the day. When Royce came down the stairs, he picked up the coffee and took a sip and said nothing. The morning light came through the open doors and fell across the shop floor, across the tools on the walls, across the young woman bent over an engine with grease on her hands, and the specific, unshakable focus of someone who had decided finally to stop running. He sat in his chair near the office door and watched her work, and the sound of the wrench turning and the engine breathing filled the shop the way music fills a room that has been quiet for too long. Ren Maddox had spent her entire life learning how to disappear, how to fold herself into corners, how to make her body smaller, her voice quieter, her presence so thin it barely registered on the surface of the world. She had perfected it. Invisibility was her armor, her strategy, her survival. Every instinct she had pointed in the same direction. When the world gets loud, get small. When trouble finds you, run. When someone comes looking, make sure there's nothing left to find. But something had shifted the night Royce told her about Derek. She had stood at the door with her backpack on her shoulder and her blanket rolled under her arm, ready to walk back into the dark, back to the stairwell, back to the concrete and the cold and the slow erosion of everything she was. And Royce had looked at her with eyes that were not asking her to stay for his sake. They were asking her to stay for hers. And when he said the words, I lost my son, I couldn't save him, something cracked open inside Ren that she had kept sealed shut for 3 years. She had stayed. Not because staying was easy, because leaving would have been the same thing she had always done. And for the first time in her life, Ren Maddox was tired of doing the same thing. That night, after Royce went to bed and the shop was dark and quiet, Ren sat on the floor of the small room above the garage and stared at the ceiling and made a decision. It wasn't dramatic. There was no music, no sudden clarity. Just a thought that arrived the way dawn arrives, slowly and then all at once. She was done running. The next morning, she told Royce she needed to borrow the truck. He didn't ask where she was going. He just handed her the keys and went back to his coffee. That was the thing about Royce. He didn't demand explanations. He trusted the process the way he trusted an engine. You give it fuel, you give it time, and you listen to what it tells you. Wren drove to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. She had never walked into a police station voluntarily. The last time she had been inside one, she was 17, picked up for sleeping under an overpass, processed like a number, released with a citation she couldn't pay, and a court date she couldn't keep. Every memory she had of law enforcement involved being moved, being processed, being looked at with a particular expression that said, "You are a problem we don't have time for." But she walked in. She asked for Lieutenant Sandra Marsh. The woman at the front desk looked at Wren the way people always looked at her. A quick assessment, the worn clothes, the calloused hands, the eyes that were too old for the face they lived in. Then a second look, slower, because something about the way Wren stood, straight-backed, hands at her sides, jaw set, didn't match the first impression. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Wren said. "But she'll want to hear what I have to say." Marsh came out 12 minutes later. She was 45, sharp-featured, with short hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She wore her badge on her belt and her skepticism on her face. She had been the one who led the welfare check at the shop. She had been the one who asked the hard questions, who looked at Wren with professional neutrality, while the world tried to spin a story that wasn't true. Wren sat across from her in a small office with a window that looked out onto a parking lot and a filing cabinet that had a coffee ring on top. She told Marsh everything. Not the version she had rehearsed. Not the careful, defensive version designed to minimize exposure and maximize distance. Everything. She told her about Thomas Maddox, the paramedic who died on Route 11. She told her about Catherine Maddox, the mother who followed him 2 years later. She told her about the houses, the relatives, the doors that opened and closed. She told her about the mall, the stairwell, the 6 months of cold concrete and stolen food, and the slow suffocation of being 19 years old and completely alone. She told her about the day in the food court, about the man on the floor and the crowd that didn't move, and the sound her father's voice made inside her head when her knees hit the tile. Press, count, breathe, don't stop. And then she told Marsh something else. "Someone filed that complaint against me," Wren said. "Someone told you I was a squatter. Someone suggested that Royce was doing something wrong by letting me stay there." She paused. "I want to know who." Marsh leaned back in her chair. She studied Wren for a long time. Not with suspicion, with something closer to recalibration. The look of someone who had filed a person into one category and was now watching that person refuse to fit. "Why does it matter?" Marsh asked. "Because it wasn't random," Wren said. "And because if someone is trying to hurt Royce to get to his shop, they'll try again. And next time, I might not be there to answer the door." Marsh didn't respond immediately. She opened a folder on her desk, flipped through several pages, and then closed it again. The complaint had come through an anonymous tip line. Standard procedure, no name attached. But Marsh had been doing this job long enough to know that anonymous didn't always mean uninvolved. "I'll look into it," Marsh said. "To it." Wren nodded. Then she stood up and did something she had never done before. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Her GED study schedule, her work hours at the shop, Dorothy Haskell's phone number, Royce Callahan's phone number, a list of customers who could vouch for her. She had written it all down the night before sitting on the floor of her room because she understood now that the system didn't care about stories. It cared about paper. It cared about evidence. It cared about the things you could prove. She placed the paper on Marsh's desk. "That's where I am," Wren said. "That's who I'm with. That's what I'm doing. If you need to check on me, you know where to find me. I'm not hiding anymore." She left the station and drove back to the shop with the windows down and the wind on her face and a feeling in her chest that she could not name, but that felt for the first time in years like something other than survival. 2 weeks passed. The shop hummed. Engines came in and went out. Wren's hands moved with a confidence that had deepened over the months, muscle memory layered over discipline, instinct sharpened by repetition. She could hear things now that she couldn't hear before. The particular rattle of a loose valve cover, the subtle knock of a timing chain that needed adjustment, the whisper of a bearing that was 3 weeks from failure. Royce had taught her to listen, and she had learned the way she learned everything, completely. Customers came back, the ones who had drifted away during the trouble, the ones who had read the comments online and wondered. They returned one by one, not because the story had changed, but because the worst hadn't. Wren's repairs held. Her diagnostics were accurate. Her attention to detail bordered on obsessive, every bolt checked twice, every connection tested, every bike returned cleaner than it arrived. Word spread the way it always does in small communities. Not through headlines, but through handshakes. Through one person telling another. The girl at Callahan's shop knows what she's doing. Royce watched from a step back. He still came down to the shop every morning, coffee in hand, but his role had shifted. He offered advice when asked. He corrected technique when necessary. But more and more, he simply stood in the doorway and watched Ren work, and the expression on his face was one he hadn't worn in 4 years. Pride. Not the loud chest-beating kind. The quiet kind. The kind that sits in your throat and makes it hard to speak. Dorothy Haskell came by on Thursday evenings. She brought food in containers that were always too large for 2 people, which was the point. She sat at the workbench and talked about the mall and the weather and the television shows she was watching, ordinary things delivered in an ordinary voice, and the ordinariness of it was the gift. She never made Ren feel like a project. She never made her feel like a rescue. She just showed up the way she had always shown up, with food and presence and the kind of loyalty that doesn't announce itself. On one of those Thursday evenings, Dot looked at the wall near the office door where Royce had pinned a photograph of Derek, 22 years old, standing beside a motorcycle, grinning at the camera with the careless confidence of someone who believed he had time. She glanced at Ren, who was bent over a textbook, whispering answers to herself. "He would have liked you," Dot said. Ren looked up. Then she looked at the photograph. She studied it for a long time, the way she studied engines, with patience and attention, and the understanding that everything worth knowing takes time to reveal itself. "I would have liked him," Ren said quietly. And then she went back to her textbook, and Dot went back to her food, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed to be said. The calm lasted 16 days. On a Tuesday night at 2 in the morning, Ren woke to a sound she knew. Glass breaking. Not the accidental kind, the sharp, clean sound of a dropped cup. This was different. This was deliberate. Heavy. Multiple impacts. The sound of something being destroyed on purpose. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, heart hammering, bare feet on the cold floor of her room. She moved to the window and looked down into the shop. The front window was shattered. A figure moved inside, dark, fast, swinging something heavy. She heard the crash of equipment being knocked from shelves, the metallic clang of tools hitting concrete, the splintering sound of wood breaking. Her first instinct was the one that had kept her alive for 18 months on the street. Run, get small, get invisible, find the stairwell, find the dark, let someone else deal with it. She was already reaching for her backpack when she stopped. Her hand hovered over the strap. Her fingers touched the fabric, and something inside her said no. Not a voice, not a thought, something deeper, something that lived in the same place as the rhythm of chest compressions and the sound of her father's voice. A refusal, quiet and absolute. She was done running. She picked up her phone instead. The phone Royce had given her 2 months ago, the first phone she had owned in over a year. She dialed 911. Her voice was calm. She gave the address. She described what she was seeing. She stayed on the line. Then she went downstairs. Not to confront, not to fight. She stood in the doorway between the living quarters and the shop in the dark, and she watched. The figure was moving quickly, smashing equipment, overturning shelves. But the cameras were recording. 4 cameras mounted in the corners of the shop, installed 3 weeks earlier by members of the Iron Wolves after the trouble with the welfare check. Royce hadn't told Ren about them. He hadn't wanted to worry her. But they were there, red lights blinking steadily in the dark, capturing everything. The figure paused near the workbench. Ren's workbench. He swept her toolbox off the surface with one arm, and the tools hit the floor with a sound like bones breaking. Then he grabbed a can of spray paint and tagged the wall. One word large and sloppy: fraud. The sirens were already audible when the figure turned toward the door. In the blue flash of approaching lights, Ren saw his face. She had seen it once before, weeks ago, when he had come to the shop and stood too close and spoken too loudly and looked at her with the particular contempt of a man who believed that people like her had no business existing in spaces like this. Vincent Hale. Viper. He was gone before the first cruiser pulled into the lot. Out the broken window, across the parking area, into a dark truck that peeled out with its headlights off. But the cameras had seen everything. His face, his truck, his license plate, the word he had painted on the wall. Lieutenant Marsh arrived 20 minutes later. She stood in the destroyed shop with her hands on her hips and her jaw set and the look on her face that said this was no longer a welfare check. This was a crime scene. Wren walked her through it, calmly, clearly. She pointed out the camera positions. She described the timeline. She identified the figure she had seen. She did not shake. She did not cry. She stood in the wreckage of the place that had become her home, and she spoke with the precision of someone who understood that words like hands could be tools. You didn't run, Marsh said. It wasn't a question, no, Wren said. I didn't. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once the way people nod when they have made a final decision about someone. Vincent Hale was arrested at 6:14 the following morning. He was at his apartment, asleep, with spray paint residue still visible on his right hand and glass fragments embedded in the soles of his boots. The cameras had captured everything. His face, his movements, the sequence of destruction. When Marsh played the footage for him in the interrogation room, he didn't deny it. He just shrugged and said, Callahan had it coming. But the cameras had given Marsh something else, a reason to dig deeper. Over the following week, Marsh and her team pulled the thread. The anonymous complaint that had triggered the welfare check at the shop was traced to a prepaid phone purchased at a gas station 3 miles from Leland Price's home. Price, the mall manager, denied involvement at first. Then phone records surfaced showing 17 calls between Price and Hale in the 6 weeks preceding the complaint. Text messages followed, conversations that painted a clear picture. Hale wanted the property Royce's shop sat on. He had been pressuring Royce for months. When Royce refused to sell, Hale shifted strategies. He went after the weakest point he could find. Wren. The complaint about squatting. The anonymous tips to social media accounts suggesting Royce was exploiting a young homeless woman. The carefully worded insinuations designed to make a 58-year-old man helping a 19-year-old girl look like something it wasn't. All of it traced back to Hale with Price as his willing instrument. But it didn't stop there. Marsh's investigation expanded. 2 other small business owners in the area came forward with similar stories. Pressure to sell, anonymous complaints to code enforcement, vandalism that was never solved. Hale had been running the same playbook for years, leveraging fear and bureaucracy to push people off properties he wanted. He had done it quietly, patiently, targeting people who didn't have the resources to fight back. He had miscalculated with Royce Callahan, and he had badly miscalculated with Wren Maddox. Hale was charged with vandalism, property destruction, harassment, and conspiracy to file false reports. Price was charged as an accessory. The case moved quickly. The evidence was clean. The cameras didn't lie. On the day the charges were formally filed, Wren stood outside the courthouse with Royce and Dot and 4 members of the Iron Wolves who had driven in from 3 different states. None of them said much. They didn't need to. They stood together on the courthouse steps in the late afternoon sun, and the fact of their presence said everything. A reporter approached, young woman, microphone in hand, cameraman trailing behind. She recognized Wren from the footage, the barefoot angel. She asked for a comment. Wren looked at the microphone. She looked at the camera. She thought about all the months she had spent making herself invisible, all the energy she had poured into not being seen, and she realized that the thing she had been afraid of, the thing that had kept her in stairwells and shadows, was not the world seeing her. It was the world seeing her and deciding she was nothing. But she wasn't nothing. She had never been nothing. She had been a girl with her father's hands and her father's knowledge and a courage that 200 people in a food court didn't have. She had been a mechanic who could hear an engine's secrets. She had been a student who studied under shop lights until the words stopped swimming. She had been the person who didn't run when glass was breaking. She looked into the camera and spoke. My name is Wren Maddox, she said. 6 months ago, I was homeless. I was living in a parking garage stairwell. I had no shoes, no phone, no one. And when a man's heart stopped in front of 100 people, I was the only one who moved. Not because I'm special, because my father taught me that you don't just watch, you act. And that's what I did. That's what I'm still doing. The clip aired that evening on 3 local stations. By the next morning, it had been shared 40,000 times. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. Because a 19-year-old girl with calloused hands and grease under her nails stood in front of a camera and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had earned every word. The story was retold. Not the blurry security footage version. Not the mystery angel version. The real version. Ren Maddox, daughter of a paramedic survivor of a system that failed her at every turn, who saved a stranger's life with skills her dead father taught her and then walked away because she had learned that the world doesn't usually reward people like her for being brave. The narrative shifted. People who had written comments calling her a fraud deleted them. People who had questioned Royce's motives went quiet. The truth, it turned out, was more compelling than any of the stories people had invented. 3 weeks after Hale's arrest on a Saturday morning that was cool and clear and smelled like engine oil and fresh coffee, Ren Maddox sat at a folding table in the back of the shop and opened an envelope. Her hands were steady. They had been steady for a while now. Steady on wrenches and steady on textbooks and steady on the handlebars of the motorcycle Royce had been teaching her to ride on Sunday mornings in the empty lot behind the shop. She pulled out the paper and unfolded it and read it twice. She had passed. Her GED, not by a slim margin, by a wide one. Scores that her instructor had called remarkable, which was the kind of word that made Ren uncomfortable because she didn't know what to do with compliments that came without conditions. She sat there for a moment holding the paper, and the shop was quiet around her. The bikes on the lifts, the tools on the walls, the smell of grease and metal, and the particular warmth of a place where things are built and fixed and made to run again. Then Royce came down the stairs. He was moving better these days. His color was good. He had started seeing the cardiologist regularly, taking the medication, listening to his body when it told him to rest. He looked like a man who had decided after 4 years of slow surrender that living was worth the effort. He saw the paper in her hands. He saw her face. "Let me see that," he said. She handed it to him. He read it once, then again, then a third time, holding it at arm's length because he refused to admit he needed reading glasses. Then he laughed. A real laugh, full and surprised and entirely involuntary. The kind of laugh that comes from a place that has been closed for a long time and suddenly isn't. They celebrated with takeout eaten off the workbench, grease-stained hands holding paper plates, and Dot showed up halfway through with a cake she had bought at the grocery store. It had yellow frosting and blue letters that said, "Congratulations, graduate," and it was slightly crushed on one side because Dot's car had taken a turn too fast. 4 members of the Iron Wolves arrived unannounced with a card signed by 19 people, most of whom Ren had never met, but who had written things like "Proud of you" and "You earned it" and "Welcome to the family" in handwriting that ranged from careful to nearly illegible. Ren pinned the GED certificate on the wall near the office door, right beside the photograph of Derek Callahan, 22 years old, grinning beside his motorcycle. She didn't ask Royce's permission. She just did it. And when Royce saw it, he stood very still for a very long time, and he didn't say anything, and he didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, the shop changed. Not in the dramatic overnight way that stories prefer, in the slow, accumulating way that real change actually happens. More customers came. Repeat business increased. Ren took on the scheduling and the inventory systems that Royce had let decay during his years of indifference. She organized the parts room. She updated the pricing. She created a filing system that actually made sense, something Royce had never managed in 30 years of ownership. The shop's reputation, which had survived on history and loyalty for years, began to be rebuilt on something more durable. Quality, consistency. The knowledge that when you brought your bike to Callahan's, the young woman who worked on it would treat it like her own. Royce stepped back, not all at once, in stages. He came down to the shop in the mornings but left the heavy work to Ren. He answered questions. He offered guidance. He sat in the old chair near the office door and drank his coffee and watched the shop fill with the sound of someone working with purpose, and the sound was enough. He rode again, not far, not fast, but on Sunday mornings he pulled his bike out of the garage and rode the back roads east of town where the hills rolled green and the air smelled like cut grass, and there was no sound except the engine and the wind. He rode because the doctor said he could in moderation, and because riding was the only prayer he had ever known. The second bike appeared in the garage 3 months after the GED, a used Sportster similar to the one Derek had ridden, but not the same. Royce had found it at an auction, bought it for a price that made the seller suspicious, and spent 2 weeks in the shop after hours rebuilding it. When Ren asked what it was for, he just shrugged and said every mechanic needs a bike to ride. She knew what it was for. They didn't talk about it directly. They didn't need to. Some things are understood in the space between words, in the way a man leaves a key on a workbench and walks away, in the way a girl picks up that key and holds it in her palm and feels the weight of what it means. Wren got her motorcycle license on a Thursday. Royce was in the parking lot of the DMV when she walked out, leaning against the truck, arms crossed, pretending he hadn't been nervous. The first Sunday ride was in October. Early morning, the air sharp with the coming cold mist sitting low in the valleys. Two bikes pulled out of the garage and turned east. Royce in front, Wren behind, and then side by side, and as the road opened up and the hills spread out before them like a promise. They didn't speak. The engine spoke for them. Steady, rhythmic, the sound of two machines running. Clean. It was Dot who first suggested the outreach program. She brought it up on a Thursday evening between bites of casserole in the same matter-of-fact tone she used to describe weather. There are others like her, Dot said, nodding toward Wren without looking at her. Girls, young women, sleeping in garages and bus stations and under bridges. Nobody sees them. Nobody helps. If they're lucky, someone leaves a sandwich near a trash can. She paused. That's not enough. Wren looked at Royce. Royce looked at Dot. Dot looked at both of them like she was waiting for them to catch up to something she had known for months. The program started small. A room at the community center on Willow Street, donated by a city councilwoman who had seen Wren's interview on television and made a phone call. Basic supplies, toiletries, clean clothes, food that was warm and didn't come from a garbage can, a shower that locked from the inside, a list of resources, shelters, clinics, legal aid printed on paper and tacked to the wall. But Wren understood something about the young people who walked through that door that the bureaucrats and social workers and well-meaning volunteers did not. She understood that the first thing a person needs is not a pamphlet. It's not a referral. It's not a program with an acronym and a mission statement. The first thing a person needs is to be seen. So Wren sat at the table near the door, and she looked at every person who walked in. She looked at them directly with her full attention, with eyes that said, I know where you've been because I've been there too. She didn't ask questions they weren't ready to answer. She didn't push. She just made herself available the way Dot had made herself available, the way Royce had made himself available. Present, patient, there. They came, slowly at first. 1 or 2 a week, then more. Young women mostly, but not all. Teenagers who had aged out of the system with nowhere to land. Young men with hollow eyes and clenched fists, and the particular silence of people who have learned that asking for help is more dangerous than going without. Wren talked to them about work, about GEDs, about the trades, mechanics, electrical, plumbing, the kind of work that used your hands and paid a living wage and didn't require a college degree or a family with connections. She talked to them about the things no one else talked about. How to open a bank account when you don't have an address. How to get an ID when you don't have an ID. How to walk into a room full of strangers and not feel like you're trespassing on their world. The CPR classes were Wren's idea. She proposed them on a Tuesday, standing in the community center with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the way that Royce had learned meant she had already made up her mind and was simply informing him of the decision. Everyone should know this, she said. Everyone. Not just paramedics, not just nurses, everyone. The first class had 9 people. Wren taught it herself, kneeling on the floor of the community center with a CPR dummy borrowed from the fire department. She showed them hand placement. She showed them compression depth. She showed them how to count, how to breathe, how to keep going when their arms were burning and their body was screaming and every part of them wanted to stop. She taught them the way her father had taught her. Calm, patient, certain, with the absolute conviction that the knowledge she was passing down could mean the difference between someone living and someone dying on a cold tile floor while 100 people stood and watched. The classes grew, 20 people, then 30. Then the fire department started sending instructors to help. Then a local hospital donated equipment. Then a phrase appeared on flyers and social media posts, simple and direct, printed in bold letters above a photograph of Wren Maddox kneeling beside a practice dummy, her hands positioned on its chest, her face focused and intent. Don't just watch. It was a Saturday when they went back to the mall. Almost exactly 1 year after the day everything had changed. Royce suggested it. Wren agreed, though she didn't say much on the drive over. The Ridgewood Galleria looked the same, smaller, maybe the way places always look smaller when you return to them after you've grown. The food court was crowded, trays slid across counters, ice rattled in cups, laughter stacked on top of arguments. The same noise, the same lights, the same flow of people, moving through a space they would forget the moment they left it. They walked to the spot, the tile floor near the cereal aisle, between the pretzel stand and the smoothie counter. There was no plaque, no marker, no sign that anything had happened there. Just tile clean and cold worn smooth by a million footsteps. Wren stood quietly, hands in the pockets of a jacket that fit her properly, bought with money she had earned. Boots on her feet, good ones, steel-toed, the kind that a mechanic wears. Her hair was clean and pulled back, and her face, which had carried the sharp edges of hunger and exhaustion for so long, had softened in ways that had nothing to do with weight and everything to do with rest. She looked at the floor. "I didn't think about it," she said after a moment. "I just moved." Royce stood beside her. He was wearing the same leather vest. The patches faded the eagle on the back, still stitched in gold thread. His hands were in his pockets, and his shoulders, which had carried the weight of 4 years of grief and the near certainty of his own death, were straighter than they had been in a long time. "That's what heroes do," he said. "They don't think." Or they stood there longer than necessary, letting the noise wash over them. The same noise that had once collapsed into the sound of a heartbeat and the counting of a barefoot girl who refused to let a stranger die. People moved around them, shopping bags, swinging phones, glowing unaware of what had happened on this exact stretch of tile beneath their feet, unaware that a man had died here and a girl had brought him back, and both of their lives had started over on this cold, ordinary floor. A child ran past, laughing, chasing something only he could see. A woman called after him with a voice that was equal parts exasperation and love. The sound echoed off the tile and the glass, and for a moment it sounded like every mall in every city, in every story where ordinary people do extraordinary things, and the world keeps turning anyway. They left the mall together, walked through the parking garage, past the stairwell on the 3rd level, where a broken fire door still didn't latch, and a fluorescent light still hadn't been replaced. Wren glanced at it as they passed. She didn't slow down. She didn't stop. She just looked the way you look at a place you used to live, with recognition but not longing, with the understanding that it was part of her story but not the end of it. 2 weeks later, Royce sat Wren down in the shop office, which was cleaner and more organized than it had been in 30 years, and told her something he had been working on with his lawyer for over a month. He had established a legal guardianship framework, not adoption. Wren was 19, a legal adult. This was different. A formal sponsorship, a legal acknowledgement that Wren Maddox was part of his household, under his protection, with rights to the living space above the shop and access to the resources she needed to build whatever came next. It wasn't about ownership. It wasn't about obligation. It was about making official what had already been true for months. "You're not my daughter," Royce said. He said it carefully because the words mattered, and he wanted them to land right. "You're a grown woman who's earned everything she has, but you're family, the kind you choose." Wren read the papers. She read them twice because she had learned that papers mattered and words on paper mattered more. Her name was there. Royce's name was there. The address of the shop was there. Dorothy Haskell was listed as an emergency contact. She signed her name at the bottom of the page. Her handwriting was neat and deliberate, each letter formed with the care of someone who understood that this signature was different from all the others. This one was not for a citation or a court appearance or a form that would be filed and forgotten. This one meant something. This one was a door that opened from the inside. On the last Sunday of October, 2 motorcycles pulled out of the garage at Callahan's Motorcycle Repair. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of cold that bites at your knuckles and makes your eyes water and makes the world look sharper than it has any right to look. Frost on the grass, mist in the valleys. The road stretching east toward hills that rolled like waves frozen in mid-motion. Royce rode in front, Wren beside him, then ahead, then side by side, again the distance between them shifting and closing, the way it does between two people who trust each other on the road. Their engines were steady, their speed was moderate. They rode the way people ride, who are not trying to get somewhere, but who are simply grateful to be moving. They passed the church on Route 11, where Thomas Maddox's funeral had been held 5 years ago. Wren didn't slow down, but she turned her head just slightly, just enough to see the white steeple against the blue sky, and something in her face shifted, not sadness, something quieter, acknowledgement. They rode for an hour, then they turned around and came home. That evening, Wren taught her third CPR class at the community center on Willow Street. 22 people this time. Young women from the outreach program. 2 firefighters who had come to observe and ended up staying. A retired school teacher who said she had watched the news footage 7 times and cried every time and decided she wanted to know how to do what that girl did. Wren knelt on the floor. She placed her hands on the chest of the practice dummy. She positioned them the way her father had taught her, one hand in the center, the other on top, fingers interlocked, elbows locked. She looked up at the faces watching her. Faces that were uncertain, nervous, hopeful. Faces that looked the way hers had looked once, kneeling on a living room floor with brown carpet and too much afternoon light. She smiled, not a big smile, the small, steady kind that comes from knowing exactly where you are and how you got there and what you're supposed to do next. Your hands can bring someone back, she said. Her voice was calm, patient, certain. Her father's voice carried forward through 5 years of grief and loss and concrete floors and cold water and bare feet on tile, and the relentless rhythm of compressions counted out loud in a crowded food court while the world stood still. Never forget that, she said, and she pressed down. 1, 2, 3.